Hey everyone, this is Amit, and welcome to this podcast called Random Cricket Photos That Make My Guests Happy. A podcast where we are going to hear a number of special guests talk about some really special photographs from cricket, photographs that are memorable to them, that are their favorites, and that make them happy. But before we begin our episode, let me talk about one photo from my side.
The pitch today looks very good. It's a nice dry wicket. Magnificent shot, Greg Chappell. Beautiful placement.
Jeez, what about that? Listen to the crowd now. They're into him.
He's not happy. He's not at all happy.
You would not believe that that was possible.
Should be caught, could be caught. It's
In the 1930s, in a match between Sussex and Surrey, John Langridge bowled a half volley which Surrey's Freddie Brown drove firmly in the bowler's direction. What followed was a rather ugly scene. The full-blooded drive took out umpire Frank Chester's arm, which fell several meters away from him. The umpire left the field amidst some awkward silence and returned with his arm back. Luckily for Chester, the ball had struck his artificial arm. The real arm was long gone. A left-handed batsman who played 55 first-class matches, Chester rendered his services to the Royal Field Artillery of the British Army when the First World War began. In 1917, a shrapnel wound turned gangrenous, resulting in him getting his arm amputated. But 5 years later, undeterred by his loss, Chester returned to the cricket field to begin his new innings, this time as cricket umpire. For the next 2 decades, he umpired in hundreds of first-class matches and a world record 48 test matches, and was hailed by Don Bradman as the finest umpire ever. This is a picture of him signalling a wide with one real arm and one artificial one. This is also a picture of courage for me. Welcome to this episode of Random Cricket Photos That Make My Guests Happy. And we are widening our net and finding cricket lovers from all over the world. Siddharth Vaidyanathan joined us from Seattle, Annie Shah joined us from Somerset, and today joining us from Singapore is Mr. Anindya Dutta. Welcome to this podcast, Mr. Dutta.
Thank you very much. I mean, it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you to you for joining us from all the way from Singapore. So, you have been a banker who has lived all around the world as well as a cricket writer with 4 very successful books. Let me ask you, when did this banker turn into this cricket lover? Or was he a cricket lover all this while before turning into a banker?
Well, I think from our Indian roots, you have no choice but to be a cricket lover from when you're a kid, right? So I guess my first love affair with cricket started when I was 7 years old. India playing West Indies at the Eden Gardens, going in there with my dad and watching Bishan Singh Bedi come in and bowl to the West Indians. That's my first abiding memory of a cricket match, and it was love at first sight, both for cricket and for spin bowling. So
No
that
wonder.
survived. That survived, and I went to college in Calcutta at Presidency, then became a banker eventually. I didn't think I would be a banker, but I was. I've been a banker for over 25 years. But then the love for cricket never died away, I guess.
And that's how Wizards came into being, right?
Yeah, indeed it did. I started writing a few years ago because I'd always loved writing. I'd loved history and of course cricket. And it was by chance a few years ago that I decided to write an article for an Australian website, and one of the great cricket writers of our time, Kersi Meher Homji, who lives in Sydney, picked up the article and wrote into me through the editor to say that I should really write more. And for that particular article, there was a book in it. And I started corresponding with him, and that turned into Spellbinding Spells, which was actually my second book, and that's how the journey started.
So about Wizards, it has, done fantastically well. And of course, it is a book that is very close to your heart. So question is that what proved to be the motivation to write about Indian spinners?
Well, like I said, the first vision of cricket was Bishan Singh Bedi slowly trundling in between the umpire and the stumps with the most perfect bowling action you can ever imagine. It is the most perfect bowling action I have seen from any kind of bowler anywhere in the world. And coming in and bowling at a pace which should not normally worry the greatest batsman in the world, and watching them fumble and not being able to handle it. And that's when I fell in love with spin bowling. So what happened was when I wrote a few books, and then I was reading Ramchandra Guha's Spin and Other Turns, which is not a oft referred to book, because Corner of a Foreign Field is much more what he's known for cricket history. But Spin and Other Turns is a fascinating little book that has only one chapter on spinners. But there was something very interesting which Guha said there. It said that I hope someday someone writes a history of Indian spin bowling, because that's what the genre deserves. And what I found was that there had been a couple of attempts since then, but there was no book which actually was a comprehensive history of Indian spin bowling. And there certainly wasn't one the way I wanted to write it, which was to tell the stories. Because, you can write history books, but for me, a history book, even though I love history, can be extremely boring if you don't tell stories. So the whole point of Wizards was to tell the story of Indian spin, starting with the first great Indian spinner, Palwankar Balu, and it expanded in scope, I would say, Wizards, as it went along. After I was commissioned by Westland to write it, it sort of expanded in scope, where I decided to cover every spinner who had ever played for India, just to make sure that I was giving due credit to the genre. And that's how I tried to make it as recent as possible. And at the time of going to press, I think Washington Sundar was the last spinner who had debuted for India. So for this edition, he remains the last spinner. So that's a history of 120 years.
That's a great story behind the story of so many spinners. And I'm so glad that you answered to that call which Ramchandra Guha had given in that book. No one paid heed to it, but you did it. And what a wonderful book that has come out of it. In fact, one thing that I feel that it's a great book for our times, especially because when T20 was on the rise, there was a lot of speculation about how well would the spinners would fare in this format, whether they would be able to remain relevant in the shortened format or they would become a liability. But a decade on, you see they have really adapted so well to rule the roost. I mean, the top 4 wicket takers in T20, the list includes 3 spinners. So they are actually more less than Wizards in the way they keep figuring the ways out to remain relevant.
It's a very interesting point, because this is something that I've discussed with a lot of the people who I interviewed during the book, the cricketers, including Dilip Doshi and as a batsman, V.S. Lakshman, a whole bunch of batsmen, but also a lot of the older spinners. Not everyone is, as you can imagine, from the older generation, is a big fan of T20, although I'd say most have been converted. But the reality is that every one of them said the same thing, that you have to be a good enough spinner, whatever format you play, to do well. And what you find in T20 is that, as you rightly said, it is the spinners who have adapted to the format who are successful. But then there's a caveat to that. I mean, since we're talking about the T20, which is that it is also a failing of the batsman, because the batsmen, who are the 3 top spinners in the world that you're talking about? They're all wrist spinners.
Yes.
There isn't a single finger spinner among them. Okay. And the reason, I think, why wrist spinners are successful, besides the fact that they're obviously more difficult to play, is that in T20, the batsmen do not have time to watch the bowler's hand. And because they don't have time to watch the bowler's hand, a wrist spinner has an inherent advantage when he bowls a googly of any kind. So the
Definitely.
batsman is actually not able to follow the ball, which is why they get out more often. And having discovered that, I think the wrist spinners have gone for the kill, and they've managed to find other ways to really constrain the batsman and frustrate them and start taking wickets. And it's a self-effacing thing, right?
A very fascinating insight that into the mind of T20 bowling, especially in our times. T20 cricket is all over the place, and we have so much change happening in cricket, and spinners again are the ones who have adapted so well to it. Okay, turning our attention to the task at hand, which is you picking 5 photos from the game of cricket that make you happy. And since you have written this wonderful, wonderful book on spinners, sir, let me ask you, is this list going to be, dominated by spinners?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it just makes sense, right? Because I continue, despite having written this, 400 odd page book, I continue to remain fascinated by spin bowling. Every opportunity I get to have yet another conversation with a Bishan Singh Bedi or a Dilip Doshi or whoever I can get hold of, there is yet another conversation on spin bowling. So I think it makes sense for those perhaps who haven't read the book yet to hear about the backstory of a few spinners, because I think we've all heard about or read about certain bowling spells or the fact that India won the Oval 1971 and Chandrasekhar basically won us our first victory in England. So you've heard stories like that, but then the backstory of these spinners who are absolutely amazing characters, and some of them are thankfully, in fact, 4 of the 5 that I'm going to talk about are thankfully still with us and were able to give me a lot of time to talk to them. I think their lives are fascinating, their stories are fascinating, so it's probably worth talking about it.
Great, then. A lot of stories coming our way. So which photo that would be the 5th in the list would you want to talk about first?
Well, let's do it chronologically in one way, but in another, probably the spinner who fascinates me the most. And a lot of the time things fascinate you because of something that is missing, which creates a mystery. So in the case of this man, Subhash Gupte, probably there is an argument to say that he fascinates me because I never saw him bowl. But he actually fascinates me because he is not so talked about today, where we talk mainly about the quartet. But Subhash Gupte was probably the greatest leg spinner the world has ever seen. And I say this absolutely with the knowledge that I'm including the likes of Shane Warne. Okay. So, and I don't say this by myself as a writer of Wizards. I say it because people who should know what they're talking about say it. The greatest cricketer who lives on today, Sir Gary Sobers, was very, very clear a number of times that he's never seen a greater leg spinner than Subhash Gupte. And when Gary Sobers tells you that, he's mid-80s, he's seen every spinner, well, up to on the current spinners from the earlier Australian spinners as well. And when he says something like that, you've got to sit up and take notice. There must be some good reason for that.
Without a doubt.
So Subhash Gupta is a very, very fascinating character. I mean, when I started researching his life, I spoke to a number of batsmen who had played him. In domestic cricket as well as in international cricket. I spoke to a number of his teammates who had bowled with him, people who had seen him and learned from him. And every account tells me the same thing, that he was just an absolutely amazing leg spinner. He didn't play a lot of Test cricket, but he took a lot of good wickets. Now that's just an amazing statement, right? Because when you're talking about a spinner taking a whole number of wickets, the batsman he dismisses is important, and the wickets that Subhash Gupte took were of some of the best batsmen in the world. Gary Sobers goes on, he says he could do things that I still don't believe all these years later.
Amazing.
It is really amazing. I mean, he went on his first big tour where he became world renowned was in 1953, India's first tour to the West Indies. The entire Indian bowling outfit took 107 first-class wickets that entire tour. Subhash Gupte took 50 out of them.
Wow.
It's just a completely amazing performance. He also happened to meet his future wife during that trip, who he got married to later, and that's another story. So his was a fascinating character. I mean, think about it. If you think about what happened to the career of the spin quartet, their careers basically ended with the Pakistan tour of 78-79 when Kapil Dev made his debut, because things really didn't go well. It was completely flat tracks. Pakistani umpires wouldn't give any decisions against the batsman, and not a single one on the whole tour, by the way. I mean, there wasn't a single LBW. So it was very, very difficult. And every Indian spinner, if you look at the record in Pakistan, has had a miserable tour. Subhash Gupte picked up 21 wickets when he went on the Pakistan tour at 22.61.
Great story.
So, yeah. So it was a great character, the career, and what makes the whole story interesting is what happened after that. He would reach his peak in 1958-59 when the West Indies came to India. That was not an easy team to play against. It had Conrad Hunt, Rohan Kanai, Gary Sobers. And then the real sad part of the Subhash Gupte story, which probably unfortunately makes a part of the legend, is that a couple of years later, England comes to play in India. Gupte bowls really well. He makes England collapse from 87 for 1 to 100 for 5 at Kanpur. And then the teams come to Delhi for the test match. So the teams are staying at the Imperial Hotel in Delhi, and Subhash Gupte is sharing a room with A.G. Kripal Singh, who's an off-spinner all-rounder. Subhash Gupta is not even in the room. He's playing cards with Vijay Manjrekar and a whole bunch of other guys. And Kripal Singh calls up the reception, and he's like the look of the receptionist. So he asks her if she would like to come up for a drink. The receptionist goes and complains to the manager, who happens to be an ex-Indian Army person. The manager comes to the Indian team manager and lodges a complaint. So Kripal Singh is suspended along with Subhash Gupte. Now, Subhash Gupte has absolutely no idea why he's been suspended. First, he didn't make the call. Second, he wasn't even in the room. There is a hearing at which they're not even invited. Later on, the board secretary gives an opinion that Subhash Gupte should have prevented the phone call being made. Now, Gupte is so disgusted that he sarcastically replies that he's 5 feet 6 inches small. He's way smaller than the 6 feet tall Kripal. So he had been unable physically to do it. Yes, but it gets worse because the board president, M.A. Chidambaram, for whatever reason, otherwise a great administrator, for whatever reason, decides that the team which is going to West Indies right after that will not include Subhash Gupte. And Subhash Gupte walks out of cricket and never plays again.
What a tragic ending to such a brilliant career that.
It's just an an amazing story. Mihir Bose, when he wrote his history of Indian cricket, I mean, he had this fascinating line in there, which I think pretty much sums it up, where he said that India's first great spinner ended his career because he happened to share a room with a man who wanted to have a drink with a girl. Only in India could it have happened.
So true. So much moral policing there.
Absolutely. Anyway, so that's the story of Subhash Gupte.
So which would be the second photo after Subhash Gupte?
I would pick the photo of Irapalli Prasanna. The reason why I would say Prasanna, because after Subhash Gupte, when Pataudi took over the reins of the Indian team, Nari Contractor got hit on the head as captain in the West Indies. 21-year-old Pataudi, who by that time only had one eye, one properly working eye, was asked. The youngest member of the team was asked to take over as captain, and once he got used to it a bit after a year or so, he did a lot of introspection and thought about the reason why India would never win, right? Because India had a really bad track record in Test cricket. They were just unable to win matches. They won one-off matches, but never a series. And he thought about what it would take, what India was missing, and what it would take to form a side that would be able to consistently win Test matches. And what he came up with was fascinating. What in Wizards I call his version of the blue ocean strategy, where the blue ocean strategy is a management strategy which came years later. But essentially what it says is you go out there and find something which no one else has tried. You find your own blue ocean, which is effectively a new way of doing things to achieve what you want to achieve. And what Pataudi did was that he found that India's strength was in spin bowling. So India had no medium pacers even to speak of who would walk into any other cricket team as a medium pacer. Forget about fast bowlers, right? I mean, we didn't have, after Amar Singh and Nisar in the 1930s, we didn't have a fast bowler until Kapil Dev came along. So we're talking now about the early 60s. So how would you win matches? You could only win matches if you took 20 wickets. And the only way to take 20 wickets was if he picked as many spinners as he could put into the side who would take him those 20 wickets. So that's how he came up with the spin strategy. And that spin strategy eventually resulted in Bedi, Prasanna, Chandrasekhar, Venkatraghavan becoming the great quartet that they were. And the first among them to come in, independent of Pataudi actually, was Prasanna. Because Prasanna came in very early in I think 1961, 62 into the team. He did reasonably well. And then he walked out of the team because he had promised his father that he would complete his engineering. So he went away, did his engineering, and then came back 4 years later. Just imagine an Indian Test bowler doing that today, right? It was different times.
4 years of no cricket, my God.
But what was fascinating about Prasanna was that, again, like Subhash Gupte, Prasanna is a fairly short bowler. So flight became his biggest weapon. And India had one good off-spinner before him, which was Ghulam Ahmed. But Prasanna was in a different league. I'll quote you Ian Chappell, because I think Ian Chappell was one of the best batsmen against spin bowling, along with Ken Barrington, probably of all time. So Ian Chappell told me this about Prasanna. He said, Pras was the best opposition spin bowler I played against. Not off spin, best opposition spin bowler I played against. He was seeking your wicket every ball he bowled. And you knew you were locked in a serious mental battle each time you faced him. His flight was impeccable. There were many times when I left my crease, certain that I was going to get to his flighted delivery, at least on the half volley. It never happened. my estimated time of arrival never coincided with Pras's appointed destination.
That's beautifully written.
Your chapter told me something else, which is kind of years later. I don't know if you remember, there was a Aussie off spinner called Gavin Robertson. He came to India.
1996 in India.
Yeah. So when Gavin Robertson was in India, Ian Chappell requested Prasanna to just go out there in the nets and give him some tips. And so Robertson was very, very eager to learn, and he knew Prasanna was great on flight, so he kept tossing the ball up, and then Prasanna apparently turns to Robertson and says, "Gavin, it's not an invitation to be hit into the grandstand. It's a request to be lofted into the outfield." That's the subtle difference, right? And then he goes on to explain to him that the higher up the ball back you hit, the more the loft on the shot, the less distance it will travel. So that should be the aim of a flighted ball, to get the ball to hit as high on the bat as possible, so the batsman makes a mistake.
And Ian Chappell, you can always expect him to tell the truth as it is. He's not one to sugarcoat things.
He does not mix words.
So when he's saying something, you have to believe it. And when he's praising someone, there has to be something really meritorious in that person. All right, 2 photos done. First was Subhash Gupte's, second was Erapalli Prasanna. Now are we moving closer to 70s and 80s?
So the next photo that we have is one of my favorites, Bishan Singh Bedi, and the reason for that is, as I said before, to me, Bedi's action is perfection. It is a lesson for anyone who wants to be a spin bowler.
A lot of people would concur with that, without a doubt.
Yeah. What really fascinates me about Bedi is that his action looks not only perfect, but there is a science behind it. While interviewing him, I actually asked him right at the end that, what do you think made the quartet special, right? There must have been a reason, right, why you had 4 really great spinners at the same time, and they were largely all successful. And he said that he'd spent a lot of time thinking about it after he finished, and he concluded that the reason why they were successful was because all of them were technically perfect when they bowled. They were all different in how they bowled, but they were all technically perfect in the sense that their actions were all perfectly suited to bowl spin side on, the hand coming from above, very smooth, nothing to impede, no jerky motions that would impede their movements. So there's a science behind it. There's a fascinating book which on Bedi. It's a biography of Bedi written by Suresh Menon. It makes for lovely reading, called Bishan. Suresh Menon said something. Obviously, he worked quite a lot with Bedi, so I didn't want to repeat the work that he'd done. And he says some very, very fascinating things. He says few understood better than Bedi the separate roles played by the fingers, the palm, the arm, the shoulder, the hip, the leg, and the toes. He could alter the position of one of them at the top of his bowling mark and change the delivery. He could pitch 6 balls in an over. It's amazing. He could pitch 6 balls in an over on a 50 paisa coin, but the batsman seldom realized that each time it came from a slightly different direction, a slightly different angle, or at a slightly different pace. And that's all it takes, right? It is not rocket science. I mean, spin bowling is a lot of practice, it's a lot of brains, but it's not rocket science. It's just that you've got to do these things well.
It's a lot of mind, it's a lot of skills, mental skills, I would say, to deceive and, defy the batsman's best shots, best abilities. So, yeah.
To your point, I asked Bedi that what was his favorite form of dismissal, right? I mean, it's, every bowler, as if you ask Jasprit Bumrah, he'll probably tell you a Yorker which knocks off all 3 stumps, right? Bedi's answer was that he loved the fact when a batsman was stumped. He said, I enjoyed that most because then I had beaten the batsman twice. Once in the air and then again off the wicket.
What a joyous Bishan Singh Bedi we used to see after he got the batsman stumped, and no wonder why. There is victory. There is victory not only once but twice in the mind of the bowler when he gets the batsman stumped. And the batsman
Absolutely.
just has no other option but to put his head down and walk straight to the pavilion because he has already made a fool out of himself getting stumped out. So yeah, can understand why Mr. Bedi loves that dismissal so much.
Another part of his personality, of his career, which fascinates me, was his captaincy. The reason why people don't pay attention to that, because his record is not like an MS Dhoni, a Virat Kohli, or a sort of Ganguly, right? But you also have to understand that he was a captain at a very tough time when it wasn't so easy for India to win so many matches, because we didn't really have an all-rounded team all the time. You didn't always have a well-rounded team when you wanted one. So it was always the batsman either didn't score runs or it was a completely flat wicket or whatever. And it was a team which was still being formed in a way. Captaincy was often switching between people, between Gavaskar, between Bedi, between various people. But his approach to captaincy was so different from anybody else's because he wanted to win. He was one of those captains who did not care if he lost in his quest to win, because that was his job. His job was to go out and win matches, right? And he would do that and make sure that people played the game in the spirit in which it was supposed to be played. And if they didn't play it that way, he was unafraid to stand up and say it. So he was not very popular. In 76, 77, when England came to India, Lever, Tony Gregg, team Lever was cheating. I mean, that's the bottom line, right? He was using Vaseline on the ball to make it swing. He was found out. Bedi raised a huge hue and cry. The Indian board didn't want trouble with the MCC. So they asked the MCC to decide whether they were guilty. And of course, they were not guilty. The result was, after playing for a decade and a half in the county, Bedi lost his contract.
Some consequence that.
One of the you talked about, you mentioned the West Indies Space Quartet, right? Which at one time, the West Indies Space Quartet arguably came into being because of the Indian Spin Quartet. In 1976, when India went to West Indies, the West Indies had just come back from Australia. They'd been almost killed by Thompson and Lilly. They had no idea what had hit them. So they came in to play against India. At Port of Spain, Sobers declared, leaving India 400 odd to get. And India got those runs. And in that match, most of the wickets were taken by the Indian spinners on a turning track, and the West Indies had 2 or 3 spinners, I think, and they couldn't get wickets. So in the next match at Sabina Park, basically Lloyd dropped his spinners, all his spinners. He packed the team with fast bowlers and asked them to bowl at the body of the Indians. He basically reenacted Bodyline, if you like. I had a long chat with Vengsarkar, because Vengsarkar was the only one among the top batsmen who were not injured that day, right? In that match, there was a news report which said that when the Indians boarded the flight, it looked like a hospital going up there, because they had bandages all over. They were battered, the whole bunch. So Vengsarkar was the only one who had not been injured, and I asked him how he coped with it, and he said, "I just got lucky. That's all. I mean, there was nothing to this. There was this ridge on around the leg stump." And Michael Holding was being asked, young Michael Holding, I think in the second series, was being asked to bowl into that ridge to hit the batsman.
All right.
So what that did was, and what Bedi did in that whole thing was that when he saw his batsman get injured, he declared the innings. Okay, I think India were 97 or something like that, and he declared the innings. And then in the second innings, after 5 wickets were down, he didn't have any batsmen. So he just went to Lloyd and said, "We're all out."
That's a brave move, I would say, in the face of some real battering that the Indian batsmen were taking. It was a very brave move, and it tells about a man who knew how to stand up to whatever the
Yeah,
situations were and had a very clear mind when it came to taking decisions. He did something similar against Pakistan in, I believe, Sahiwal against.
in Sahiwal, that was,
Yeah, so
absolutely. I mean, India needed 23 or 14 balls, which even at that time, when in one day was eminently gettable, right?
yeah. And
That
we had the wickets
Gundappa
as well.
Vishwanath, yeah, that Gundappa Vishwanath at the crease. I think Gaikwad and Vishwanath at the crease. And so Sarfaraz Nawaz comes in and bowls four successive bouncers to Vishwanath. And Karsan Ghavri described this to me. He said, two Vishis standing one on top of the other couldn't have touched this. So Bedi walked out, basically asked them to come in, walked out and said, I concede the match. It was the first one-day international ever conceded because he thought the Pakistan team wasn't playing fair.
A man who had a penchant for taking strong decisions easily.
Absolutely. Whichever way you look at it, but it's just very, very admirable in my mind, at least, the way he operated.
Without a doubt. So fourth picture, is that also of a spinner? And if that is, who is that spinner?
So it is. And it is perhaps the most fascinating, in a way, among the quartet, Bhagwat Chandrasekhar. A man who, after Gupte, was India's greatest leg spinner, but of a completely different type, right? So Chandra, when he was very young, was afflicted by polio, and his right arm till today remains fairly withered. There aren't many muscles in it. And then he started playing, and he thought that he might not have been able to, bowl. But then somehow he realized something when he went out there to play. And Chandra actually played. He didn't even play first-class cricket until he was picked. I mean, he effectively played local cricket and then he was picked up. So what he found was that not only could he control the length and line while whipping his arm through, you have to realize that his arm, because it didn't have muscles, could only work one way, which was as a pulley, right? So he had no chance of flighting a ball. It just wasn't possible. And a leg spinner like that had never been seen. So any coach who came across to him would say, you have to flight the ball, without realizing that he couldn't flight the ball, because that's not how his arm worked. His arm was
physically impossible.
Completely like a pulley. It was impossible, right? So there was only one single pulley action that his arm was capable of, right? And there was no difference in arm action or arm speed by which a batsman could judge what he was bowling. But then he realized that while doing that, he could actually control the length and line. But only he knew what the length and line would be like. So they couldn't watch his hand. A leg spinner, going back to what we were saying during T20 cricket discussion, that it's watching the hand which makes the real difference in how you play a spinner. But at Chandra's speed, they couldn't watch his hand. So they couldn't differentiate between his faster one, his googly, his leg spinner. So he was...
The batsman couldn't figure out what he was bowling.
Yeah, and there's been this myth, and I wanted to get rid of that myth, that if you talk to people who've seen Chandra bowl, and they're all convinced, as if they're all pundits about it, where they will tell you that Chandra himself didn't know. It's a myth which has been perpetuated over the years, that Chandra himself didn't know what he was going to bowl. Okay, so what I did was I asked actually the one person who I thought could tell me the correct answer to that. I couldn't naturally ask Chandra whether he knew what he was doing, because I already firmly believe that he knew what he was doing, and that was not the right question to ask. So I actually called Syed Kirmani and asked him to tell me his experience with Chandra, because he was wicketkeeper for a significant part of Chandra's career. And Kirmani grew up on Chandra and Prasanna, because when Kirmani was 16 years old, he used to keep wickets at the Karnataka State Cricket Association nets, and Chandra and Prasanna used to come in to bowl there. So he tells me the story about, and he used to call them both sir at that point in time because they were much older than him, right? And so he says, people had told him the same thing. So one day he told Chandra, sir, please bowl all the 6 different deliveries that you know. Okay. He said, so Chandra started with a top spinner, then he bowled a googly, then a faster one, then an off cutter, 2 leg breaks, one on the leg stump, one on the middle, both hit the wicket.
Wow.
And he said he told me before every delivery what he was going to bowl.
Showing his full wares.
So
putting them all on exhibition there.
I think the only issue was that every time, like it happens with a lot of leg spinners, it always took Chandra time to settle down to his line and length. And this has been a traditional problem with leg spinners. Every leg spinner faces that, right? That they take more time to settle down than a finger spinner just because of the kind of delivery that they bowl. But other than that, he was just an amazing bowler. And the greatest performance he ever had was clearly in 1971 at the Oval, and that's something. Whoever watched that match, David Frith tells me about it. There are a few other people in England who've talked me through it, who were there at the ground as youngsters at that point in time. And the one I would say overbearing memory from that tour that they have is that Chandrasekhar spell, 6 for 38, where
that helped India win a historical Test series in England for the first time ever in 1971.
Absolutely, and I can only imagine what would have happened, as an aside, if he had been chosen for the West Indies tour before that. Remember that, whatever we say about Ajit Wadekar's captaincy, and Wadekar, I'm sure was a good captain, but we didn't win those series because of Wadekar. We won the West Indies series because we won one match, and that one match was won for us by Salim Durrani's bowling. 2 deliveries, won that. At the Oval, it was Chandra's 6 for 38, which won us that match, right? It wasn't exceptional captaincy. So, there's again this whole thing on. I think what the thing that, in my view, the whole team that Pataudi built, Wadekar had he got the fruits of that labor, let's say, and he was a decent bat and he was a good captain, but he enjoyed the fruits of that labor. But these 2 victories were just single test victories which won us those series, and one was Durrani, the other was Chandra. And Chandra's 6 for 38 not only got us our first ever victory in England 40 years after we'd started trying to do so, but also it was voted the bowling spell of the millennium.
That tells the quality of it.
Exactly. And imagine in those in the 20th century, when it was voted the best bowling spell, you also had Jim Laker, 19 wickets, right? So I think it says a lot about his quality and what he was like as a bowler. And then my last thing on Chandra was that same, going back to the same match, my first match at the Eden Gardens in 74-75. There's a lovely backstory on that one, which Bedi told me. So the final day of the match is New Year's Day of 1975, and it was a time when you played on New Year's Day. These days you don't necessarily always play. I mean, you play a Boxing Day Test match, which is over by the 31st, right? This was Calcutta, 1st of January 1975, final day of the Test match against the West Indies. Yeah, so the previous night, and India had no chance of winning. Essentially, no one expected India to win. It was a really strong West Indies side. and they were expected to win the win on the fifth day. So on 31st, they all had fun. This was Calcutta in the 1970s, right? So you had all the club parties going on, and the teams went out to party. So unlike what would happen today. And so Bedi tells me that the next morning they come onto the field and Pataudi throws in the ball, and he walks up to Pataudi and gives him back the ball and says, "I think you should give it to Chandra." Okay. And he said it was not because I thought Chandra would bowl any better than me, but it was because I still had a hangover. Right. So he said, so Chandra bowled, and Chandra was not finding his length and line, and he was getting beaten all over the place, right? And so Pataudi wanted to take him off, and Bedi either saw something or he still had a hangover. I don't know which one it is, but he told Pataudi, give him one more over, right? And he gave him one more over, and he ran through the West Indies. And then Bedi came in and finished them off. And India won that test match, and it was just an amazing victory. As a 7-year-old, I still remember that chant, because that was not about India winning. That morning was about India saving the test match, right? And the entire Inn Gardens crowd was screaming, "Chandra, Chandra, bacha be Chandra." So Chandra will save us.
Chandra will save us. Like the Messiah.
So that's an endearing memory that I have. So there's lots of Chandra stories. I could go on all day, but no.
We have to come to the final one, which has to be the final photograph. And who is that person? Who is that spinner?
So the one I picked is Dilip Doshi. And if you look at that photograph, there's a good reason why I chose that photograph of Doshi on his final delivery stride, and you can see, how perfect it is, and how classical and where he's delivering it from. But I'll take you back to that photo. But Doshi was a very, very fascinating character. He was a contemporary of Bishan Singh Bedi. They're around the same age, couple of years difference. So there were a lot of great, as it would so happen, there were a lot of great spinners around the same time, especially great left-arm spinners around the same time. So there was Bedi, there was Paddy Shivalkar, there was Rajinder Singh Goel, and there was Dilip Doshi. Right? They were all competing for a place, and because Bedi was there, none of them were getting it. And for Doshi, it was particularly difficult because Indian cricket, through the ages, until Saurav Ganguly came around, was a very parochial setup as far as cricket is concerned. The one part of the country which was completely neglected was the East. It didn't matter how good the players were from the East; they never got a chance to play. So Doshi played from the late 60s. He finally would make his debut in 1979. Okay. At the age of 32. And there's this story about, which tells you what Indian cricket was like at that point in time. In 1976, the English team comes to India, and they beat India in everywhere that they play. The only team which comes close to beating them is East Zone, right? And Doshi by himself almost bowls East Zone to victory. He takes 8 wickets, right? In Guwahati, this is played in Guwahati. So it's fine. There are no selectors for that match, at that match, watching them play. Not one, right? So, of course, this doesn't surprise the East Zone players because, this was a normal occurrence. And then in the evening, they have a dinner. And Ken Barrington, who's the manager of the England team, who knows Doshi because Doshi's been playing, county cricket for years by then, he tells him that Raj Singh Dungarpur, who was a national selector at that time and a friend of Ken Barrington, had asked him to make an unofficial match report of the East Zone's performance, just because they couldn't bother to be there. Anyway, so Doshi comes in, and in 1979, it's again another very interesting backstory how he actually gets selected. Because remember, I mean, he's been out there for 11, 12 years playing, and nobody's ever picked him, right? So there's this 1979 Indian team under Venkatraghavan playing in England. You remember the famous Gavaskar 221, where he almost wins the match for India, right?
Yes.
And so after that, they're having dinner for team and for guests before they leave the country. And Gavaskar overhears a conversation between Rohan Kanai and the manager of the Indian team. Rohan Kanai happens to be there. It's the discussion. It's a discussion on the future of Indian spin bowling and the fact that who will replace the quartet when they eventually retire, because Pakistan's not yet happened, so nobody knows what's going to happen, right? Kanhai is very surprised that the search so far had ignored Doshi. And he tells the manager, you have a ready-made world-class spinner in Dilip Doshi who's been playing county cricket for many years. He could walk into any team in the world. Why are you looking further? So Gavaskar overhears this conversation. It's over. Then they get on the flight. And in one of the most bizarre things among the hundreds of bizarre things that Indian administration has done, on the flight, the Air India flight, the pilot announces that Venkatraghavan has been sacked as captain and Gavaskar has taken over in his place on that flight. So what happens thereafter is that there's Australia series, and then Gavaskar decides, after hearing that conversation, from what I've been told, to include Doshi in the team, and he suddenly gets a call up. He's sitting in England, he gets a call up, he comes there, and he has a fantastic series. In his first series, he takes 27 wickets, just runs through the Aussies, dream debut. And then, because he was ready, right? As a spinner, he was 32 years old at the peak of his form. So it was just, perfect in a way. And he played for 4 years, took 114 wickets, something like that, in a 4-year span. But to go back to the photo and the reason why I have such huge respect for Dilip Doshi. 1981, India goes to Australia. They come to the final test match at Melbourne. India is down in the series. Teams which are down going into Melbourne at the end almost never ever manage to draw the series or win it. Traditionally, that's the way it's been. It's not that Melbourne's not been the easiest place in the world for subcontinental teams to go in and win. But India's playing well. They go in there. Now Dilip Doshi, in the previous tour match, has been hit on the first left toe off an inside edge while he's batting. So he hadn't taken it seriously, but then after the match, he's almost unable to walk. He goes to a hospital on his own, and the doctor tells him after doing an X-ray that it's a fracture. Right? He's desperate to play the test match. He only tells his roommate about it. Right? Nobody else. So I think there are only 2 people in that team actually who knew about it. It was T. Srinivasan and Dilip Venkatragar. They were the only ones who knew about it. He doesn't tell Gavaskar, right? Because he wants to play. He so desperately wants to play. So all he says, he tells Gavaskar that it's hurting a bit. So I'd like to ease up on practice a little bit before the match. So Gavaskar says, that's fine, no problem. And as long as you know what you're doing, you experienced enough. So he doesn't bowl much, takes rest. He has a physiotherapist coming into his room, giving him heat treatment, whatever. He goes in there. He starts bowling. He has a fractured instep on his left leg. And I repeat that, left toe. When you see that photograph and you see where he puts the weight while delivering the ball, you'll realize why I think that photograph is important.
That means every
What
time
he does,
he delivered the ball, he was in pain.
he bowled 52 overs. He took 3 wickets. Australia put on 419 runs, right? And this is a remarkable match. At the other end is Shivlal Yadav. He gets his toe fractured while batting by Len Pascoe. Deliberately. Len Pascoe was deliberately targeted. Len Pascoe and Jeff Thompson were brutal, especially Len Pascoe was absolutely brutal. So he deliberately targets him between him and Rod Marsh. He tells him where he's going to hit him, right, when he's batting. So it's real intimidation. So then he gets his toe fractured. So Shivlal Yadav is bowling from the other end. You've got Doshi bowling from this end. Both of them have fractures. Kapil Dev tears a thigh muscle and doesn't bowl, right? He walks off after a while. So these two, along with Karsan Ghavri and Sandeep Patil, bowl through the... Then in the second innings, when Australia has 143 runs to win, so, Australia is going to win, right? They've got the Chappell brothers. They've got an amazing batting lineup. They're going to win for sure. Karsan Ghavri and Kapil Dev still not there. So Karsan Ghavri comes in. Australia is 24 for 3 at the end of the 4th day. Karsan Ghavri bowls an amazing spell. Next morning, Kapil Dev comes back. By this time, Shivlal Yadav cannot bowl, right? So Kapil Dev and Dilip Doshi, one person with a torn thigh muscle, the other with a fractured instep, bowls India to victory in Melbourne. The bravery that these 3 guys showed, particularly Doshi, in winning this test match, which gets completely forgotten in the list of great Indian test victories, is for me what really makes this special.
Definitely. Yeah. What stories that have not been told. And thank you so much for telling these stories. In fact, with Dilip Doshi, you always end up thinking of the question of what could have been. For someone who made his debut so late and was so successful in such a brief career, you can only wonder what could he have done if the debut had come a little bit earlier. And so what a story, more than 100 wickets after a debut at the age of 32, and this wonderful win that he orchestrated with others.
Yeah, I mean, so these are a few of my favorite photos, if you like. So
thank you so much. This was one fascinating journey down the memory lane, recounting the contribution of some, real wizards who got India so many glories. And thank you for being such a wonderful guide on this journey. Great. Wish you all the best with your future endeavors. And thanks for coming to this podcast. It was so entertaining listening to all those stories, which we really haven't heard too often. Keep entertaining cricket lovers with your books, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure, and I hope people found it interesting and get to read Wizards, because it's not because that I've written the book that I want them to read it, but it's because I want the fantastic history of Indian spin bowling to be preserved, and as many people to know about it in the current generation as they can. I mean, because history is important, because what we have is what guides us for the future, and spin will always remain an integral part of where Indian cricket goes.
Spoken like a true history and cricket lover. That. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
To all our guests, we promise to bring you more amazing guests who would tell us all their favorite 5 photos from the game in the coming weeks. Till then, as I say at the end of every episode, stay happy, love cricket.